A warm welcome to Lost for Words, a podcast exploring the opinions, glories, and interesting stories of guests. I am your host Jason, and for this week's episode, I am joined by Willie Rennie, MSP. Willie was the leader of the Scottish Liberal Democrats from 2011 to 2021, a tenure which included the independence and Brexit referenda. Therefore, he's a fairly famous face within the world of Scottish politics. He and I chat about his leadership, the first independence referendum, the Lib Dems suffering due to the previous coalition with the Conservative government at Westminster, the present day Scottish government and where the battle lines will be drawn in any mooted or potential second independence referendum. We covered a lot of ground. Willie is a pleasure to interview, and he includes an abundance of context in each of his responses. I hope you enjoy. A quick housekeeping note before we get started. Please leave a rating or a review wherever you get your podcasts, whether that be Apple, Google, Spotify, Podbean, or any other platform. It's the best way the podcast can grow and better content can be produced for you, the listener. It's your listening experience that matters the most. But enough from me, now on to today's episode of Lost for Words. Why are you a Liberal Democrat and you're a sort of LA party political heroes or idols, so to speak?
I've been a Liberal Democrat, I think, all my life, as far as back as I can remember. I grew up in the time of the SDP Liberal Alliance, which was on the rise, and it was quite exciting because we were making a lot of progress with Shirley Williams and David Owens and Roy Jenkins and the like. So it was a very exciting political period. I'm a reformer. I believe in the power in the hands of individuals means they can do great things. I believe in investing in education. We're kind of centre-left, I would say, on the political spectrum. I believe in the market, but also having a social conscience. I would argue that we're for aspirational people with a social conscience, people who care about those who live next door, across the world, or indeed in the future. And that's where the climate comes in. So we're quite altruistic people, but we're reformers. We're in the power of the individual. That's what Liberal Democrats are about. And that's why I'm a member of the Liberal Democrats and have been since I think I was 17 years old. So it's in my blood and it feels right. It's the party for me.
How old were you when you became involved with the party?
I think it must have been about 17, round about that age. I think when I went off to college, I was really quite committed at that stage. So I can't remember exactly the day that I joined, but so it's round about that. So 1984, 85. So in the wake of the miners' strike, a lot of political strife, the war in the Falklands, those were the kind of issues that were prominent in my mind around that time. And I didn't think that the industrial conflict, the left-right constant tension was good for the country. And I wanted a more pragmatic, progressive alternative to that, to that approach.
The purpose of me having you here today is just to speak about, obviously, the current state of politics in Scotland and the UK, but I couldn't then speak about that unless I did speak about the past and the coalition. How much damage or opposite do you think that did to Liberal Democrats, having been a party of coalition with the Conservatives and the UK government?
I mean, I've not been shy about saying it's been incredibly damaging. There's no doubt about that. I mean, I supported it at the time. I thought it was the right thing to do. I thought in some ways it was, I know people won't buy this, but in some ways we were putting country before party. There was a massive financial and economic crisis. We needed a stable government. Labour weren't capable of doing that. I haven't been in power since 1997 and, to be honest, run out of steam, and I think they would admit that themselves. And we needed a stable government to deliver that change. And so in my view, we didn't really have an awful lot of choice. But it was no doubt that it was damaging. I regret some of the policies that were implemented. I think some of the other ones were brilliant. I think the pupil premium, I think the work we did on the Green Investment Bank were tremendous. I think the triple lock on the pensions, the income tax changes to make sure we took a whole lot of people on low incomes out of tax altogether. I think all those things were brilliant, outstanding things. But some other things were bad, and I made no bones about it. I think the bedroom tax was a big mistake, and obviously the tuition fees issue. But you've got to look to the future. You learn from those mistakes, and I think we're frank with people about that. But you can see under my leadership with the Liberal Democrats in Scotland, we were committed to tackling issues like mental health, investing in education, early education, a particular passion of mine, making sure young people get the best start in life, challenging the government on things like industrial intervention, on things like Lochaber and BIFAB, on the police centralisation. Liberal Democrats have been energetic in our commitment to creating a fairer society in Scotland, and of course been against independence and against Brexit, because we believe that we should be working with our neighbours rather than against them. And so I think you see with Liberal Democrats that we have got a soul, that we're passionate for reform. We've learned our lessons, but we're moving on. And I think, to be frank, most people have moved on. They've understood where we are, and the fact that we've learned from these things.
In moving into 2022, this is a year of the local elections. So what role do you think Liberal Democrats can play in shaping people's lives in a positive way at the grassroots and sort of local authority level?
Well, tomorrow I'm going to Glasgow to campaign with Joe Macaulay, who's one of our candidates in the Lynn ward, in fact, in Glasgow. Great, energetic, grassroots, community campaigner, a typical Liberal Democrat grassroots campaigner. And that's what we do really well. I mean, you can ask anybody in the country who's got a Liberal Democrat councillor locally, and they'll tell you they are excellent at staying in touch and taking action on local issues, of reporting back. All of those things are part of who Liberal Democrats are. We believe in community politics, which was actually first established in Liverpool in about the 1960s by the Liberal Democrats. We kind of reformed the way that local councillors operated. Rather than just sitting in committee meetings, we were active in communities. And that's what we do really well. And I'll be going across the country, meeting great candidates, stunning people like Daniel Coleman up in Dundee, making sure people like Eugene Clark in Leven, our candidates in Edinburgh are outstanding. We'll have a really good night in Edinburgh this year. But I think we'll have a good time across the country as well, because we've got some brilliant candidates. So, yeah, if you want an active local councillor, then you can do worse than voting Liberal Democrat, because they do stick up for you at the local level.
As we know, COP26 was in Glasgow. Do you think there will be a positive and genuine lasting legacy? Because I think the concern for a lot of these big events is that you come away with a lot of promises and not so many fulfilled promises. But what's your take on it all?
I was slightly sceptical about the whole process at the start, but it kind of clicked in later. I was sceptical because it looked like lots of people were going just to have their picture taken. And that's not what climate change action is really about. But in the end, it kind of clicked into place that having all those people there put tremendous pressure on all of the world leaders to go further. There was a spotlight for 2 weeks permanently on the countries of the world about what they were going to do to deal with this massive international global crisis. And I think in the end, it shifted things along, whether it was on climate finance or on coal, or on inefficient subsidies for fossil fuels, on deforestation, all of those things, big commitments. Now, the big challenge is, can you actually deliver it? And that's where, I'm fascinated in terms of how it actually works on the ground. So I'll give you one tiny example, and it may seem insignificant, But there are 2 housing estates in my constituency that are being built right now, and they're going to be built with gas boilers installed in them. Now, to me, if climate action means anything, it means stopping new stuff using bad fuels for the climate. But here in this country, which boasts about its action on climate change, we're putting gas boilers in homes. And what's even more illogical is 100 yards from one of the housing estates is a new, brand new district heating system set up by the university in St Andrews. Now, to me, that's illogical. And if we are going to turn the words of COP26 into real action, we need to start by doing it ourselves, because we can't expect the rest of the world to do it if we are not doing it. So I think we're brilliant at targets. We're brilliant at boasting about how great we are. But the actual action is like turgidly slow. And that's where it really comes down to. Can we really focus on the minutiae to get that done? Because the minutiae builds up to real action across the globe. So that's the kind of stuff that I'm working on. Let's turn it into action. Let's move away from the photo opportunities, and let's move away from the words and the targets into actual action on the ground.
Do you think the Greens being in coalition with the SNP helps or hinders those targets being realised? Just as obviously you're looking at it from the outside, but your intuition, would it tell you that will help the SNP along with its targets, or will it make any impact at all?
I mean, there's no doubt that it, created a focus, on the climate stuff. That's more debated probably now in the Parliament, partly because the Greens are there. The Greens do seem to have a habit of dispensing with an awful lot of their policies. So just this week, we've had the deposit return scheme has been punted back again. They promised to get rid of incinerators. They're staying. We've got the example of the gas boilers, which I've just mentioned, which is under Patrick Harvey's jurisdiction, and that's not happening. So there's lots of things that, they promised that they would deliver in government, and they haven't. Now, government's hard, as we know, but the reality is that the Greens really haven't shifted the dial an awful lot, because when you look at the actual agreement between the Scottish Government and the Greens, the actual policy changes aren't really that substantial at all. In fact, in some areas, it's exactly the same as what the SNP had promised previously. So I'm not really sure they've shifted the dial, but there's no doubt there's more of a debate about the environment now, and that must be in part because of 26, but also the Greens being in government. And let's hope it turns out to be much more positive for the climate than I fear that it will be. I think the agreement is probably more about independence than it is about the environment. But, I know that Patrick Harvey and his colleagues do deeply care about the environment. So let's hope it turns into real action from the government, and it does shift the dial in the way that I hope it does.
Obviously, COP26 having just been, I live in Glasgow, and I was told to open my doors to welcome people from around the world to come and do the thing at COP26. Does that, or do you believe that messaging hampers any new restrictions being adhered to by the public?
I mean, there's, when you look at it now, I suppose with the new variant, that does seem particularly reckless. But we did have a bit of an uptick following COP26. But I think the reality is that the new variant is having a much bigger impact than any of that. So I'm not so fearful about what that would have actually meant in practice. No, it's the new variant that's just ripping through communities just now. It's amazing, the number. I mean, I don't know if you remember, at the start of this whole pandemic, I hardly knew anybody who had the virus. But now, I know lots and lots and lots of people. There's huge numbers have got it. No, I've not. No, I've had my three jabs, but I've not had the virus yet. I expect to get it. I think I probably will get it because there's just so many people. But thankfully, I'll be more protected than I was before, and that's why I've been encouraging everybody to take the vaccine. I know there's a few skeptical people out there about it, but just get on with it and have it. because you'll regret it if you end up in hospital because you haven't taken this seriously.
That's very true. How do you rate the Scottish Government's handling of the pandemic versus the UK? Do you think the handlings of it were maybe more similar than maybe some would like you to believe?
I mean, there wasn't that much difference. Nicola's great to tell a story. She's
Yeah,
very
yeah,
good.
yeah.
Very good at telling a story. But I've praised her. I've not been ashamed to say that I think she's been very clear to people what is expected of them. And she's done it in a way that's consistent, standing up there almost every day doing a press conference. That takes a bit of steel to do that. I'm kind of losing confidence a bit because I just think she is getting, up until the Omicron, there was more politics seeping into her commentary and her announcements than I would have liked. And I think, if we're going to work together on all of this, you need to leave the politics at the door. That's what I tried to do throughout the pandemic, but she increasingly got political. And there is a debate, a genuine debate about the balance of all the different harms. And, I get really concerned about people who've got mental health issues, as you'll probably know. And it got to a stage where we were debating zero COVID. Can we get rid of COVID altogether? Which now seems absolutely fanciful. And I said so at the time, it was fanciful. But to get to zero COVID means you'd have to lock up everybody for almost ever, because it was in the community. It's not like New Zealand, but it didn't really get into the country. And the damage that would cause economically, for our mental health, as well as our general health, because we wouldn't be getting operations and the like, would have been devastating, utterly devastating. So I just think the debate got a wee bit out of kilter, and they were kind of getting caught up with their own rhetoric about being more cautious and safer than anybody else, especially Boris Johnson. And I think that was regrettable. The biggest travesty of all, however, the biggest travesty, and this is something I warned about at the time, and if you look back at the records, you'll see that I warned about it, which was care homes. The fact that I just could not understand, and I asked Nicola this repeatedly, I could not understand why they were allowing people to go into care homes without having been tested. Couldn't understand it. And their argument was, we're going to effectively create barrier nursing in the homes. So even if one person in the home's got it, it won't spread around the rest of the home. But it did. And it killed lots of people. And I couldn't understand at the time why they were doing that. That was the biggest travesty of all of this, that they did not heed the warnings from others and evidence from other parts of the world, that this was a reckless thing to do. And that wasn't that different from England. In fact, it was exactly the same as in England. So there's a bit of pomposity sometimes within the SNP that we were better than everybody else. The reality is that there's not. And I think it's regrettable that they keep making that political point, when in reality, this was a tough pandemic to deal with. But we did make some colossal mistakes that were foreseen and could have been prevented if the appropriate action was taken and warnings were heeded.
You're against the vaccine passport programme, aren't you? Am I right in saying that?
Yeah. I mean, for a couple of reasons. I'm a liberal. I don't believe in, the state having too much power in its hands over, how we live our lives, and the information about us. So, we were against ID cards, for instance. We're against super databases with lots of information on it about us. So therefore, I'm also against, vaccine ID cards as well. I think there's another reason, which is, we've been trying to encourage people to get the vaccine, and vaccine ID cards kind of compel people, in order to get access to things they would normally access. They need to get vaccinated. And I think that's a retrograde step. We shouldn't be moving to compulsion. And then, the third thing is that it doesn't work, because the whole idea of it was in part to stop the spread. So if you knew that everybody else had been vaccinated at a concert that you were at, you weren't going to get the virus. Well, that's not true. Because even if you're vaccinated, you can still get the virus and spread it. You're just not as ill as you were before. So it doesn't work on transmission grounds. Now, what it might have done is it might have got more people to get the vaccine. But that goes back to my first point. I would prefer to encourage rather than compel people to get the vaccine. So it doesn't really work. It's moving on the compulsion grounds, which I don't agree with. But the principal point is that I don't believe in the government having big databases and requiring identity cards to be able to access normal everyday things.
In the current climate, what is a standard week for you as an MSP?
Well, Parliament supposedly 3 days a week, although I try and do as much of it at home as possible because we can do remote working, although it collapsed yesterday. So just before I was about to ask my question, devastating question it was to the government, the whole system collapsed. I don't know whether it was a Nicola Sturgeon conspiracy to stop me speaking or not. But so I try and do as much of that from home. I knock on doors safely about 3 times a week, a couple of hours a time, because I think it's the best way of finding out what people are thinking. It feeds my work in Parliament an awful lot.
Good for your step count as well.
It is very good for my step count, yes, very good. So we do quite a bit of that. I do an awful lot of meetings with constituents, and also then responding to emails and so on. But and then I'm on the education committee, so I do obviously the education committee on a Wednesday morning, but meetings with various different stakeholders as well in that portfolio. So it's a busy week. Although I'm not leader anymore, I find different things to do that are incredibly, I think, important to do. So yeah, politics is a busy life, but it's the best job in the world. There's no doubt about that.
Did want to ask you, I know you aren't the leader anymore, but in any way do you find not being the leader liberating because you don't have the same, maybe the limelight can get exhausting or the pressures that are on you? Has it been in any way a monkey off your back?
Yeah, I don't have to think about everything anymore. You'd have to watch all the news. You would have to think, not just what does that mean, but what do I have to do about it? And I don't have to do that as much. I enjoy doing that still, but I don't have to do it. I don't have the internal party organisation stuff that I would have before, which was quite time consuming. And to be honest, just do different things is a great thing. So it is, in some ways, it is quite liberating. I have to say, I miss bits of it. I miss not being in charge. And I like to think I've just delegated the leadership to Alex Hamilton rather than moving on. So, but I think there's quite a bit of liberation in it. 10 years is probably enough, was my conclusion.
How exhausting was it having been the leader during the Indie Ref campaign?
That was quite tiring. It's quite challenging when you're fighting a referendum like that, because you've got many different moving parts and centres of power. So we had the 3 political parties and then people who weren't involved in any party. But within parties, you would have different power bases within each of them. So, at that time, there's a lot of Labour MPs at Westminster who thought they were in charge. There was the Labour headquarters in London. There was the Scottish Labour headquarters. There was, our part of the government in the UK. There was the Conservative government, where an awful lot of the decisions were, kind of inspired from. There was the Better Together organisation. So you had lots of different stakeholders, of which we were only one part of it. So that in itself was quite tiring. Getting around the country to to do all the different kind of campaigns. In some ways, that was the easier bit. But yeah, no, it was quite tiring, and it wasn't what I came into politics to do. I didn't come into politics to fight the Constitution. I came into politics to make the world a fairer place. To be internationalist and outward looking, to be compassionate about our neighbours and about the environment. About giving people a decent job so they could have a decent home and bring up their family in a decent way. That's what I came into politics for. And I just think it's so distracting and sapping of energy and inspiration and intelligence of the country to fight not just one constitutional battle in independence, but also Brexit. I just think it's so destructive because there are good people on both sides of this debate. If we were to work together, we could do an awful lot more.
How soon after the first referendum, because you went from we went from September 2014 into a general election the following May, and the SNP basically cleaned house with the MPs. Why do you think that was?
Well, there's a couple of things. I mean, we were still struggling from the coalition effect, so that's why I think we suffered. I think people were also kind of given the SNP a bit of a compensation, and even those who didn't support independence were kind of felt that they wanted to support the SNP because they had lost. But also, 45% loses every single referendum but wins every single election.
Yeah, that's a good point.
And that's the main problem. They had got a massive shift of people who traditionally voted Labour to vote for independence and then vote for the SNP. And the Labour Party have never quite recovered from that.
Why do you think that is? Because that's what I find, that having looked back, like having the benefit of hindsight, so to speak, that we're now in 2021 and the SNP seem to have held on to a lot of those people who left Labour and they've never turned back.
I mean, the argument they deploy is that you can get rid of the Tories forever by voting for independence. And for an awful lot of Labour voters, that's quite attractive. But it's quite interesting when you're on the doors now, when you speak to people, you go, who do you support? And they'll say SNP. And I'll say, so do you support independence? And there's this enormous pregnant pause because people just aren't sure, partly about the practicalities, although they would like to get rid of the Tories, that they're concerned about the practicalities of independence. And that pregnant pause must be very, very worrying, concerning for Nicola Sturgeon. Because in the context of all of this been going on, you've got Boris Johnson in charge, with apparently Nicola communicating well through the pandemic. All the boasts that the SNP make about them being in power. They can't get rid of that pregnant pause. That pregnant pause is really damaging for the independence movement. And they haven't really come up with the answers on the practicalities. So I think that's the issue for the SNP. But there's no doubt that an awful lot of Labour voters or former Labour voters, were attracted by the argument of getting rid of the Conservatives forever. But what they also forget is the only party that's ever had a majority, over 50% of the vote in Scotland, was the Conservative Party, not the Labour Party, not the SNP. Nobody else has had over 50% of the vote since the Second World War. So, they just need to be careful what they wish for. And also, the practicalities of independence are incredibly difficult. As we've seen with Brexit, breaking up is hard to do. And I don't think we should repeat the mistakes of Brexit.
The reason for a political party existing should be to govern. And I think, or do you not think, that it almost suits Nicola Sturgeon not to hold Indy Ref 2 because it means she can continue in her position as First Minister, whereas there is a risk to her if they hold Indy Ref 2 and say the yes side were to lose. What then for her and what then for SNP? That would probably be curtains.
Yeah, I mean, they can't afford to lose another referendum. That's true. I think Nicola Sturgeon wants it, though. I mean, I don't think it would be right to interpret the fact that she spent all her political life campaigning for independence, and just when she's got her hands in the levers of power, she suddenly goes off the idea just to keep power. I don't think that's right. I think she really genuinely does want it, but I just think she's frozen. She doesn't really know how to make the next step, to how to persuade those people who are expressing that pregnant pause that I talked about. She doesn't know how to move them over, because every time she talks about the details of independence, the more obvious it becomes that it will be just like Brexit. It's just as hard, if not more, in fact, much more. So I think that's where she's stuck. But she also knows that the Scottish public would not tolerate any party moving towards a big constitutional change like this in the middle of a global pandemic. And so she's had to put it off. She made a promise that she wouldn't do it until the pandemic's over. Doesn't look like it's going to finish anytime soon. So I think she knows she's trapped in that position. She would love to do it. She's got doubts whether she could win it. She's also got doubts whether the public would tolerate even having the referendum. So that's where I think she's got a real challenge in her hand.
Do you think the pandemic played a role in the outcome of the 2021 Scottish Parliament election?
Oh, yeah, there's no doubt. There's no doubt. I mean, I had lots of people saying, oh, Nicola did a good job. I have to say, Nicola did a good job. And Boris got the same kind of effect as well. There was a kind of a shield of protection provided by the pandemic. You know, you don't want to be disloyal to those who are in charge through a very difficult time. So there's no doubt they were voting in part, you know, to support the government that's in charge, and that was happening in Wales. It happened, you know, in elections in England, but also in Scotland. So there's no doubt that that's a factor in things. I'm not saying it's the only factor, but it certainly was a factor.
Why do you believe that the result of that election does not mandate a second independence referendum?
Because Nicola made this significant move about 3 weeks into the campaign. I was getting lots of people in the door saying to me, I've been SNP, but I can't believe that Nicola wants to have a referendum this year. And they were moving away from the SNP. And we were quite excited about all that because we thought there was big opportunities in certain seats. But then she felt that, and she said she gave this commitment that she wouldn't have the referendum until the pandemic was over. And people were reassured about that when I was speaking to them on the doors. They said, no, Nicola said it won't happen until the pandemic's over. So it's not a clean mandate at all, because it's not clear when the pandemic is going to be over. And it's not clear that the public would tolerate that, even if some felt the pandemic was over. So I think it's not a clean mandate in the way that she would like to say. She had to move. She wasn't able to have it all her own way, as she started off the campaign saying. She moved and she recouped the lost support that was building. You know, that was quite astute for them to spot that. But nevertheless, they did shift. And therefore, I think the mandate is not clear at all.
Would you foresee any mooted second referendum being closer in result to the first one?
You'll get there, but I don't think I just think it would be so distracting. But I actually don't think they'll get any closer. I mean, how bad does it have to get? You know, how
Then you
bad
could say the current, my sort of opinion is that if they don't push for it now, when you've got all that going on with the Christmas party scandal, you're never going to, like, the independence only works if you can bash the Tories. That without, and the Tories have never been so ripe for the bashing, so to speak. That's
it's a very perceptive point. No, you're absolutely just how bad does it have to get?
that. Yeah, that's it.
And if they're not getting over 50% when it's like this, then I don't think they ever will. And it's partly because people don't see the plan for independence, that transition. Because there's no doubt that small countries can do very well. I've seen that across the world. They do well. The issue is breaking up a long-term economic partnership is difficult to do, and moving to an independent country in a modern, successful country has never been done before. I know that sounds an astonishing thing to say, but modern, successful countries like the UK have never broken up. Of course, the Soviet Union broke up, but that was hardly modern and successful. They were on their knees when they broke up. But breaking up a country like ours is tough. And we saw that with Brexit. It's hard to do. And that's what people know. They instinctively feel it. And that's why we've got a pregnant pause. All those pregnant pause nationalists are saying, we're just not sure we want to go through this Brexit thing again with independence.
I interviewed a few weeks ago Tommy Sheridan, and he said that because the base was so low to start with, when IndyRef 1 was announced, the Yes campaign were polling at the low 20s, early 30s, and that they managed to get it up to 45%. So his words were, I believe they lost the referendum but won the campaign. Do you agree or disagree? I'm not saying that just to pose you against him, but I think that as a concept is interesting. So the Yes side, although they lost, they didn't get to the 50% line. Having got from 30 to 45 as a successful campaign, and that the 45 as a starting point is much better than 30. What do you make of that?
Yeah, I mean, there's no doubt they gained support through the referendum. If you don't win the election, you don't win the campaign.
Yeah.
We won the campaign. We won the election. So it's, I know they like to tell themselves they did really well, but the reality is they didn't win. And thank goodness they didn't win, because just imagine how bad it would be if they had, because the oil and gas prices just plummeted just after that referendum. Our finances would be in a terrible state. We'd be facing this pandemic, on our knees after the plunge in the oil and gas prices. I mean, how bad would it be? So thank goodness Tommy Sheridan didn't win his campaign and wasn't successful. So I don't buy that argument. Whether they can, are they saying that they will always get a 15, 20% leap in the polls every time they have a referendum? Well, I just don't think that's credible or plausible. I don't buy it. I know they like to tell themselves that that's the case, but they're increasingly talking to themselves. That's the problem. And they aren't reaching out to those pregnant pause people, but also those who are, progressive and pro-European and internationalist in their outlook. They're not really speaking to them to persuade them about the transition to independence. They've not got a plan. They just don't have one.
On the topic of the barrel of oil, that the price has never recovered from then. So I think in any IndyRef 2, that would have to be absent from the discourse, because the world has moved on. We're now in renewables. So what do you think would be the main, because it was all about the barrel of oil the first time. That was a lot of the crux of the question. What do you think the campaigning lines would be? Where would people draw the lines in the sand on both sides?
Yeah, I mean, I think the economy will still be a big factor. I think our place in the world, how we want to deliver progressive change. What's the best and easiest way to deliver it? Is it through what I would describe as the tumultuous, traumatic process of breaking up a country in order to get that? Or by changing the government at a UK level? And I think changing the government at a UK level is far easier than breaking up the country in order to get progressive change. We've done it before in this country. We've delivered great things. Whether it's the international aid budget, which my colleague Michael Moore put into law to make it 0.7% of GDP. Whether it's the establishing the state pension or creating the NHS or the welfare state, or making the tax system more progressive as we did in government, or improving the kind of the Sure Start schemes that the Labour Party did, or creating the Scottish Parliament, the various institutions of the United Kingdom to decentralise power. All of those things were done by the United Kingdom, not by the SNP. And that's, so the UK can be good and progressive. We just need to win that battle back. These things aren't easy to do. The independence would be so much more difficult to deliver that progressive change.
What would your message be to someone, say there was a soft Liberal Democrat voter, right, that is pro-EU, which means they didn't want Brexit, and the SNP coming to Indiref 2 offering them the carrot of, we'll get you back in the EU. What would your response to that be? Because I think that must be a key message for them if they are going to win. It's that EU type pulling on those heartstrings.
Yeah. There's no doubt, that people were really annoyed about the whole Brexit situation. And there'll be some people who are attracted by independence because of that. But many of them know that breaking up is hard to do, as we've seen with Brexit. There's no guarantee we'd be straight back into the European Union, certainly not on the same terms. And actually, there's better ways of breaking down the barriers to working with our friends in Europe. We can do that. We can create the relationship that will feel and look and act and smell like the European Union, even if they're not. We can build relationships just like we do with other countries in the world in a much more progressive way and pragmatic way than breaking up a country in order to hopefully re-establish a relationship with the European Union. Let's break down the barriers rather than breaking up the country. That would be my argument to them, and a lot of them are persuaded by that, which is why the SNP aren't getting that support that they're looking for.
What is your argument, as you say, to the pregnant pause people? So you ask them, are they in favour of independence? Let's say they smile at you and then they have the pause. What's your first interjection to convince them otherwise?
My argument is, what I say to them is that we can deliver change that you want in a much more speedy and effective way by working together across the United Kingdom to change the government of the United Kingdom. That's an easier way of doing it. And if we work together, we can deliver that change. That's my argument to them. Let's go for the easiest route for progressive change, not the most difficult one. And they're persuaded by that. They understand it. They're still considering all the arguments and the counter arguments. And they wouldn't be voting for the SNP if they weren't. But they are open to persuasion. What they really want, in some ways, they don't care about the structure of government. They just want the progressive change. And I'm saying to them, much easier to get progressive change my way than the SNP's way.
Having entered 2022, where would you like, firstly, the country to be at the end of this year?
I would like us to have some economic growth, improvement in living standards. I would like us to the pandemic to be out of the way, to handle it, to manage it much more effectively. I'd like our waiting times for mental health services to come down, for operations, for hip replacements and the like, to come down. I would like our education system to be back up on its way to being one of the best in the world again, rather than slipping back as it has in recent years under the SNP. I would like all of those things to happen. And I would like the Liberal Democrats to be growing substantially again, as I know we can. We've got a great new leader in Alex Hamilton, and I'm right behind him. And I think people, once they hear him and see him, they'll be persuaded by him and they'll vote for the Liberal Democrats.
Right, that's me. So just before I go, a bit of a funny story to tell you. So see, when I'm 26 now, right? So when the referendum was on, my friends and I, we've got like a group chat, but all of us were political. And so the ones that were, we made a separate group chat. We said we'd pick a name of a politician to have as the group chat name. And it was your name. You're the name.
Oh, the height of my career.
That's So just if you depart the stage at any time, you think, what have I achieved? That you became the the name of the group chat of a group of politically engaged teenagers in the East End of Glasgow. I like doing the podcast. I think, why don't we ask the person that started it all off? Yeah, it was because I think it was we were watching a Scottish referendum debate. I think, right, well, who's one of the better speakers, and we've landed on you. So I thought, yeah, go for it. Call it.
Yeah, that's great. That's really nice to know, actually, because sometimes you wonder what effect you're really having out there. Because you speak and nothing comes back, and you think, oh God. But there was, I adopted in 2015. I changed the way that I was debating, because I had been getting pummeled by opposition parties with the coalition for years, and I was doing a debate in Dundee University, and Kes Dugdale, Nicola, I think Patrick might have been there, Alex Johnson rather than Ruth Davidson was there. And I just let loose on Nicola. I think it was about Amazon and about their support for Amazon. And I just, I didn't have any restraint at all. And then Kes was speaking to me a few days later. I said, "What's happened to you, Willie?" I was talking to the shadow cabinet about the change. And she said she'd described it to them as Willie's new fuck it strategy, which I've used ever since.
And that's a wrap. A massive thank you to this week's guest for coming onto the show. I hope you all enjoyed listening as much as I enjoyed chatting. All of the relevant social media accounts can be found in the show notes. The usual bits and pieces from me to see you out. The best way to keep up to date with the latest goings on relating to Lost for Words is to follow using the handle @LostForWordsPod on both Twitter and Instagram. Send a message on either Twitter or Instagram if you have anything you'd like to ask a guest, or for a guest suggestion, or even just to leave any feedback. The best way to support the show is to hit the subscribe button wherever you get your podcasts, and if you use an Apple device, a 5-star review in the podcast app would be amazing. If you like what you hear, tell someone. Word of mouth also helps us to grow. Finally, to round off, all of your support and continued listening is genuinely appreciated. It means a lot to me to have you on this journey too. I am your host Jason, and I hope to have you back next week for another episode of the Lost for Words podcast.